Is the Ryzen 3200G still good for gaming? Well, we're going to test it in some of the most popular games here in 2023. We're going to go over the parts we used, test the built-in Vega graphics that this APU has. Then at the end of the video, we're going to slap in a graphics card and see what kind of boost in performance we get. Let's get started. The star of the show is the Ryzen 3 3200G. It has 4 cores and 4 threads. With a base clock speed of 3.6 GHz and a boost clock speed of 4 GHz, this CPU might struggle a little bit in games. The eBay pricing is all over the place, but $30 to $40 is the sweet spot if I were going to pick one of these up, only if it included the stock cooler though. Which is the cooler you should use because if you're using a 3200G, you're probably wanting to save a lot of money. So we're using it for this video. Now for the motherboard, we used an A520 motherboard from Gigabyte. It is an ITX motherboard. I had it lying around and I was going to use it for a different video, but those plans kind of fell through. So we're using it for this one. ITX motherboards are kind of expensive. So if you were going to recreate this build, use a micro ATX board, either a B350, a B450, or an A520 that you can find cheap secondhand somewhere. The RAM is very important with an AMD CPU. You want it to run at a good speed here on the AM4 platform. So we went with 16 gigs running at 3200 megahertz from Oli. I've used a lot of Oli RAM in builds and I've never had any issues. Just make sure you go into the BIOS and actually set the RAM at the correct speed so that you're actually getting your full performance. For the SSD, we went with a 1TB Gen 3 SSD from Silicon Power. The power supply though, I only used a 500 watt power supply. I had a Be Quiet gold certified SFX power supply I got in a Facebook Marketplace deal. If you were going to recreate this though, I would just use the tried and true 600 watt Apevia gold certified power supply. You can get those on Amazon for only $52. Now for the case, we went with this white version from DIY that they used as kind of an O11 replica. It's pretty cheap and it comes with 3 fans, although I did put some solid white fans in there instead because I just thought it looked better. Now that we have this PC built, let's test it in some games with these Vega graphics. Now the Vega graphics are not going to be able to run anything too demanding, so we're going to stick with the basic. First up in Overwatch 2 at 1080p on the medium preset settings, we got around 30 FPS, but it had a lot of drops when crazy stuff was going on in Overwatch with the abilities and such, so we dropped it down to 1600 by 900 to see if it made a huge difference. It didn't. We got maybe 40 FPS, but the drops and stutters were still the same. At 720p, it was kind of playable at 50 to 60 FPS. It still had a few stutters, but it was much more playable. Valorant at 1080p was definitely playable. On the all low settings, we got around 80 to 100 FPS, an occasional drop to 60 if the abilities were going crazy everywhere, but it was definitely much more playable than Overwatch. Now the next game we tried was CS2. It is a newer game and this is a much older CPU, so there was definitely bound to be some struggles here. At 1080p, we put everything on the low settings and it looked like it was going to do good around like 70 FPS, but we would have crazy random drops down to like 1 or 0 FPS, which was totally unplayable, and these would always come at random times and really hurt the performance. So we dropped it down to 720p and it was much more stable. We got around the same 70-ish FPS and there was not those crazy drops down to 1 FPS that we had when we were using it at 1080p. Fortnite is also a game that kind of ran okay on this APU. At 1080p on performance mode, all the settings were on low. We put the view distance on far because people kind of like that on Fortnite. And we got a playable experience around 60 to 80 FPS unless you hit something like a slurp truck. There wasn't a huge drop, but it stayed in that playable 60-ish FPS, so it's kind of like a console. I don't know if that's something you're into or not, but it was playable. Then we dropped it down to 720p to see if it was a little bit more playable. And sometimes it would jump around 100 FPS and it would drop down to like 70, but it seems like I felt the drops a little bit more. Even though the FPS average number was a little bit higher, the drops seemed to be a little bit worse. And the last game we tested with the Vega graphics was Apex Legends. On 1080p low settings, we got around 50-ish FPS on Apex Legends, which was really surprising to me, but I'm not complaining. I lowered it to 720p and we got more of a stable like 60 FPS, which I thought was absolutely awesome for a Vega graphics APU with only 4 cores and 4 threads. If you're liking this video so far, do us a favor and smash that like button. And if you just like building PCs on a budget or look for budget options when upgrading your PC, then you're going to want to make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our fun here on the channel. Now, the graphics card we chose for this build was the RX 580, but not just any 580. It was the 2048 stream processor version of the 580, which is like a stripped down version. It's more like a 570 with 8 gigs of VRAM. It should pair nicely with the CPU and it'll give us the ability to play more AAA titles like Halo and Call of Duty Warzone. To install this graphics card, all you got to do is push the tab here on the motherboard on the top PCIe lane, remove any screws if there are any on your case, and snap it into place. Then plug up the power cord that you should have from your power supply here. Now let's see how the performance changed now that we have a dedicated graphics card. Now we're going to go back through all the other games that we just benchmarked, but we're also going to add Warzone and Halo to see that you can actually play these games now that you have a GPU. Overwatch on the same settings we used at 1080p medium with FSR, we got around 110 to 120 FPS. Much more playable. You still had a few occasional drops, but it was never anything below 60, so I deem this super playable. In Valorant at 1080p, we used everything on medium settings for this run with the graphics card, and we got around 130 to 140 FPS. Now, sometimes it would jump up to 180 or even 200, so I would definitely cap it because that's a huge jump, and you don't really want that in the middle of battles. But when the abilities were really heavily used here in Valorant, it dropped down to around 130, so I would cap it, around that 130, 140 mark. Now, CS2 is much more playable. On the low settings at 1080p, we got a very smooth experience compared to the Vega graphics where we had random drops down to 0 to 1 FPS at random times throughout any of our matches. But with the dedicated graphics cards, it gave us the stability that we needed, and we got anywhere from like 110 to 120 FPS with some occasional drops, but it never really got below 80, so I count this as a huge win, especially for how cheap we got this system. Now, in Fortnite at 1080p, we did try DX12 just because there's a stigma there with AMD GPUs that they don't run good on performance mode, but that's not the case that I found. Here on DX12 with all low settings with the view distance on far, we got like 80 or 90 FPS with a few drops here and there depending on what was going on. So that's definitely playable and smooth, but I wanted to try performance mode just to see what it would do. So we switched it to performance mode and we put the view distance on far and everything else on low, just like we did with the Vega graphics. Now, sometimes with Fortnite, you have to play 1 or 2 games before the textures will completely render in, and it's a little bit smoother for your system. So on the second game of Fortnite we played on performance mode, we got a stable like 120-ish FPS. There were some jumps up and down below, but I would cap it at 120 FPS so that it'll be pretty stable. In Apex Legends, we also saw a huge bump at 1080p low settings. With this graphics card, we got around 110 to 120 FPS. Keep in mind with Apex Legends, I benchmark these in either team deathmatch or gun run, so your FPS may vary if you play the Battle Royale mode. Now, Warzone and Halo, you could not play without a graphics card, so here's what you can do with this graphics card. Now, in Warzone 2, the Resurgence game mode, we played at 1080p on the basic preset settings, and it was about what you expect. It wasn't super smooth, but we got like 50 to 60 FPS, so you could definitely play it. The multiplayer would be a lot smoother if you just wanted to play that, but I'm not buying that. But we turned on FSR to see if it would make a difference, and it definitely gave us a more smooth experience with everything hovering around like 57 to 63-ish FPS. It was a little bit more playable and smooth, but you had a little bit higher input delay, so it's, that's up to you and your call if you think that's worth it or not. Halo Infinite at 1080p was a little bit of a struggle in the low settings. We got like 45 to 50 FPS. It was okay, but I don't know that I would deem it super playable since it is an FPS type game. But we bumped the render scale all the way down to 72%, which was close to 720p, and we got like a stable 60 FPS, so that was definitely playable. So you could do this, if you wanted to in Halo Infinite. Now, overall, without the graphics card, this build cost me around $270. That's a combination of new and used parts. If you throw in the graphics card, that bumps it up to around like $320, $330 because of $60 graphics card. I mean, for the way it looks and how cool it looks, I think the build is not terrible. Now, to get a custom build like this for around $330 that looks really good and can run some games at over 100 FPS and even some of your AAA titles at 50 to 60 FPS, I don't think it's a terrible deal, but if you want to save up for a little bit more, a $500 system can get you this right here, so you should go check that out.